to celebrate April as National Poetry Month here today. Wonderful guest all the way from the great state of Alabama. At least it's a pretty good state. In the top 50, at least. Adam Vines, he's a great poet, though. Wonderful poet. I think of him as a young poet, but I guess that's, I'm getting some gray hairs on my head, and so I'm not that young anymore, I guess. So, but I still think of him as a young, strong, emerging voice of the South, of the contemporary South. But he definitely is an excellent poet, and I guess he's maturing and becoming one of the leading voices in Southern poetry and in Southern writing in general. But we have Adam Vines here with us, a highly accomplished poet. He's published 4 books of poetry. Out of Speech in 2018 is his latest from LSU Press. The Coal Life from 2012 from Arkansas. Day King, he co-authored, which is an interesting format, with Alan G. And again, according to discretion, with his friend and co-author Alan G. Both of those coming out from Unicorn, a great publisher. Adam was a landscaper for 20 years. That's what he needed to do, and that was his first career out of family concerns, among other things. But he really didn't have a direct concern with poetry. He didn't know he had a talent for it or any real interest in it. His interest was in the things of the world and the things of the earth. But it's amazing how deeply connected those two things become, at least in his verse, in his poems, the details of the things of this world, and especially of the earth. Not only things that grow, the landscape, those details, but also when he's out on a lake or a river, fishing, and out in the woods. That earthiness comes through in his poems. So he's not some abstract, up in the airy distant kind of poet. He's a real poet. You can understand his poems, and they're meaningful. He gathers meaning from the things of this world. He's very much alive in this world, and his poems resound with those details and with those meanings. But he was a landscaper for 20 years. He took just to better himself, I guess, to learn something more. He went back and started taking some night school classes, and he just sort of stumbled into what he thought was an English class. It turned out to be a creative writing class, and it was a poetry writing class. He immediately, I think, tried to drop it, ran the other direction, but wasn't able to do that, and so had to endure that. And then suddenly he found out he liked it, and also that he had an unusual talent for it, and that he cultivated that talent and kept growing and growing, and he's become, as I said, one of the leading talents in the South, and I would say in contemporary poetry in general. So thank goodness for that. Vines is now Associate Professor of English at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and that's where he comes from, his hometown. He's also the editor of a very fine poetry journal, the Birmingham Poetry Review. He does great work there. It'd be too much to list all the venues where he has published his poetry, but his recent poems appear in fine journals like Ecotone, the Hopkins Review, 5 Points, and 32 poems. He is on staff during the summers at the Sewanee Writers Conference. Again, one of the most prestigious venues for writers to come to in the mountains there in Tennessee. So we're very honored and delighted to have Adam Vines with us today to celebrate National Poetry Month. A regional writer, a local writer who can get the details out of a single moment or a single space, but he very much can give a deeper importance to the things beneath our feet. And here comes Adam. I'm very happy to share it with you.
Thanks, Dan. Since you brought up me tripping into a creative writing classroom, I thought that I needed to thank the two professors who coaxed me into staying, Jim Mersman and Bob Collins. I walked in, I didn't try to drop it, I walked in and looked at the syllabus, dropped the syllabus, and then started to walk out, and Jim Mersman said, "Get back in here." I said, "Well, I can't write poetry." He said, "We'll see what you can do." So I wrote my first poem, which was a poem called Transubstantiation at Buck's Pocket, which is about this wonderful place off of Lake Gunnersville that has this myth, this Cherokee myth associated with it, and where I used to hike. And I used to hang medicine wheels from trees when I was younger. I would make them out of little cedar rounds and put acorns and turkey feathers and creek stones and things on them, and I would bear climb up trees and hang them. And then one day I hung one off a loblolly that was hanging off of Buck's Pocket. And that next week I wrote my first poem in that class. So it's the integration of writing, language, the natural world, as I said to you earlier, putting my hands in the soil, getting scuffed up by bark. I think that's where I'm trying to write. I'm going to start off by reading a poem by someone else. I've started doing that in my readings, paying homage to these people before me who influenced me. And instead of just an influence for me, I've decided to talk to some of my greatest loves, my friends and family, and to ask them about poems that they admire. So this is a poem that a close friend said that she admires. To Kill a Deer by Carol Frost. Into the changes of autumn brush the doe walked. In the hide, head, and ears were the tinsel browns. They made her. I could not see her. She reappeared stuffed with apples, and I shot her. Into the pine she ran, and I ran after. I might have lost her, seeing no sign of blood or scuffle, but felt myself part of the woods, a woman with a doe's ears, and heard her die. Counted her last breaths like a song of dying, and found her dying. I shot her again because her lungs rattled like castanets, then poked her with the gun barrel because her eyes were dusty and unreal. I opened her belly and pushed the insides like rotted fruit into a rabbit hole, skinned her, broke her leg joints under my knee, took the meat, smelled the half-digested smell that was herself. I closed her eyes. I left her refolded in some briars with the last sun on her head, like a benediction. Head tilted on its axis of neck and barren bone. Head bent wordless over a death. Though I heard the night wind blowing through her fur, heard riot in the emptied head. All right. I'm going to read a few new poems from my new manuscript, and then I'll read some older poems. This is a poem that was a gift. Every once in a while, over 20 years or so, or 25 years I've been writing, you're driven to write something that comes out of nowhere and doesn't require much attention after. Probably written 3 or 4 pieces like that, where that first draft, that first purging, stays nearly the same. And those are the gift poems. Most of the poems that I write take dozens and dozens of revisions and sometimes dozens and dozens of years I had one that took 28 years to write and went through 86 drafts. And in the end, I ended up having to tear up all the drafts and delete all the files and start over completely. But this poem is the opposite of that. One night, the power was off. We had a big storm. My wife and daughter had to go to school the next day, so they went to my mother-in-law's house to spend the night so they would have power in the morning. I decided to stay home, which wasn't a very good idea in the dark. And I just had surgery. Just had my tonsils and uvula removed, so I couldn't eat or drink anything, and I was miserable. And I sat at the kitchen table with a candle and got out my moleskin and started writing, and I wrote this poem in a couple of hours at 2 in the morning. And it really hasn't changed at all since then. Maintenance for the heartbroken. Consider the houses we put together, the maintenance we do and don't do, the rotten eaves replaced, the shutters that a friend half scraped 3 years ago before the night took him back to needling that vein he thought he'd closed. Consider the toilets we spray with blue then flush down, the ball of our love's hair we snake up from the shower drain and lift in a pinch of nape as if it were a mouse. Consider what we see now at 2 a.m. in the kitchen, the grout we might or might not finally clean. The bond that holds this floor together will remain, soiled or not, we know. Consider the neighbor's generator still chugging after they have long gone to bed, though the power to our houses is back on. Consider the meat and milk that didn't go bad. We will hear the engine sputter and cease before dawn. Consider the storm that dumped 9 inches of snow in Lubbock, Texas today. Yes, Texas. Consider the woman in Montana tonight, curled into the hollow spoon of her husband after telling him of her affair. Consider her lover as merely a context for another repair, because that's all that he and the husband can bear for him to be. Consider finding ourselves not as agency, but as a slow cracking of our shells from the weather of our lives, a seam of flesh exposed that speaks the whole. 2 almost innocent glances that miss for years, intertwining one sticky night over drinks with friends. Or a sand dune that takes its shape when the clouds drift, allowing the moon to untuck its light. Consider how the clouds seem to occupy the same space as that moon, despite their distance. How we distinguish liquids, solids, gases by their properties, their distances apart, the way they veil and unveil themselves to us. Though at times, like tonight, we find in our chests that they must be compliant to their elemental change, but at their core, they're just the same. The pinch. He took a pinch from the sandstone glade and a pinch from the creek shoal where he hiked every day, a pinch from the bar where he gigged flounder and opened nets for shrimp when the tides were low. A pinch, just a pinch, like a sous chef after tasting his sauce. A pinch from the sandbox his son had long outgrown. A pinch of crumbling mortar joint from the log cabin that had been torched. A pinch from the beach where a hurricane had wiped her childhood bare. And after he was gone, she unlatched the cloisonne lid that would fit beneath the oval of his thumb and stirred the sand with a needle. She took a pinch to her tongue, along her gums, clenched it between her teeth, then swished it around, took it all down, the lung, the dune, the pink, the sweat, and threw the box away. I'm on sabbatical this semester, which is an odd animal for me. I've always been someone who has just worked, and I don't know what to do when I don't have 50 things in front of me to do. So I do things like come and read in South Carolina. But I have been writing, and all these poems are poems that I've written during my sabbatical. But one day I was sitting and thinking of what to write, as we do when we have too much time on our hands to write. And I wanted to write a poem that's a prose poem that kind of makes fun of what I'm doing in some ways. And in other ways, I think it just talks about the loneliness of trying to create art sometimes. Sabbatical poem, or Time, You Mosaic of Clicking Ignitions and Broken Shoelaces. Passing over the creek, swollen and rushing from 3 days of rain, my daughter said, "Hot water," just as she has since she believed it when she was 3. Seeing in the creek the same rolling she saw in the spaghetti pot. I say, "Yes, hot water. I wish I had a mess of crabs." And we pretend that cold as the stream is in January, it is boiling. This morning I'm 27 days from 50. I bench pressed weights I shouldn't be lifting alone in my basement and played I Want You, She's So Heavy on repeat. I grunted and spit in the corner. I dribbled some piss in the backyard bushes. The mailwoman seems to come earlier and earlier these days, but the clock is correct. She slides the mail in the 3 boxes on my cul-de-sac between 11 and 11:20, then parks and eats something out of Tupperware. I imagine her eating chicken divan leftovers today. I slice a hunk of manchego into thin triangles and trim the rind. I peel back the Sam's charcuterie packaging and lift the meat from the paper, then arrange it all on a green plate. I take a picture and put it on Instagram. Ravenous, I caption it. Then I feel silly and delete it. Then I feel sad and regret deleting it, as if someone would have seen the picture and showed up at my door, sat on the floor and eaten lunch on the ottoman with me. I play the final song from the movie Closer on repeat. Out the window, a squirrel jumps from a limb my neighbor forgot to trim back this year to the roof. She scales the pitch and crests to the other side, disappearing. She will have kits in their attic come spring. I will hear his air horn whine from the attic at nights through May. I will watch him nail flashing to the eaves where she will continue to chew through. I pay the power bill and the cable we don't watch. I pay the cancer policy my father set up for me when I was a kid. Lick the flap one full swath, then again because I taste pond water in the glue. I ruin the sticking power and have to use a length of Scotch tape. I still taste that pond water, that algae bloom and critter sex. I put the bills in the mailbox a day late. Repeat. I have a precocious 11-year-old who's been a precocious 3-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. And she would wake up early in the morning and I would go into her room and it'd still be dark outside and she would open her eyes and have a question for me. A question that she said she was dreaming about or thinking about. This happens to be a question that she asked me at the dinner table. My wife teaches dance at night and sometimes, sadly for my daughter, I'm forced to cook for her, and you can imagine what I come up with sometimes. Question from a bowl of beans. A bite of beans, a long milk drawl, and then a side glance. What's it like to be a boy, she asked. Tiresias first came to mind, the mating snakes he struck, the female dead, his 7 years in women's flesh that followed. Didacticism at its worst, I thought. Especially how to explain his lie to Hera, pleasures of the we and woo and homosocial bonds, the kind of myth an 8-year-old like mine would dig, then dig at me until I broke, explaining different parts in Dumbass Boys, the Birds and Bees. My wife was teaching dance that night and would have struck me blind if I'd gone that way. Instead, I merely said, "It ain't that bad." A lie, of course, then took another bite of beans. "The penis seems to be a lot of trouble," she said while looking down into her bowl. And once again, I thought, deflect. I could bring Nana into play, and how at 8 I told my class about my front tail, unzipped my pants to show them when they said I lied. Miss Walker screamed, the long walk down the hall, how Nana let me think I had a tail for years, until that day when I walked home and Daddy told me about the penis, the stiff-tailed ways. I knew it ain't that bad, would hardly do for this. I said, you're right, it is a lot of trouble, stay away. It's another question that she asked early in the morning. It was after we watched the Women's Marches on America a few years ago. She watched them with us, and she asked a lot of questions, and we talked quite a bit about women's rights. Morning question in bed after the Women's Marches across America for Mary. Do we deserve to live, you ask? Not do we live, or how we live, those I have stumbled through before. Dawn reticulating light through blinds, across the beds I built for your dolls. Before I trip into an answer, some softened hume or backwoods joke, or try to squeeze from you the doubt, you blurt out pilot's wife, the dream she had, what you recall from Sunday's service. You say that you woke up last night from dreams of women dressed in white while standing in the streets. And as the light reveals your face, a bar across your mouth and one across your eyes, your words dissolve, reform into a wrinkled sheet of light I lift above my head to hear and see beneath 3 million chant in unison, our bodies are not yours. You ask what is our only comfort in. I can't respond. I hide my face. In us, you say for me, with fortitude and grace. Vineses are known for being storytellers, even if we don't write poetry until later on in life. We like to sit around on old tractor tires. I can remember the Old Homestead, looking in the Old Homestead barn where we used to roast a big pig before Easter. One year, we were out running around the fields. All the kids would camp out in the fields in tents, and we would look in that barn while they're drinking beer and flicking cigarettes out the barn door and got the spit going. And I saw this kind of extraordinary hierarchy of like the older relatives down to like my father around, sitting on an old car seat all the way down to an old 5-gallon sheetrock bucket. And I sat there at that door and listened to them tell stories, and that's probably my first introduction to hearing great storytelling. I was hearing my uncles talk while they're drinking beer. And you know what they did that night? They fell asleep. Fire went out, the pig spoiled. So we all had to get money together the next day and buy church's chicken. Tell me a story. Father, tell me about the Moor who moored his boat in a moor, how he ate petrified alligator toes and hid his prayers in snail shells, how he turned into a bear, refused to hunt, spent his days licking the shadows of crows that stretched before him. Brother, tell me the one about the woman who planted her husband's pool cue in the ochre loam of her childhood creek, the smooth ash nodding into dogwood, the blue tips and sobering blooms. Tell me about the woman at the dump, her eyes large and dark as a mule's, how she enters our dreams when she gathers our junk. Mother, tell me about the bricklayer who was taken away to rebuild the city of God, how he didn't need a plumb line to lay the golden courses, how his trowel turned into a crappie when he was done. But this time, let me finish. His son mixed what he'd learned in Sunday school and comic books to try to make sense of it all. Wished he were Thor, winged crown of tinfoil on his head, his father's brick hammer dangling from a belt loop. How he descended into the underworld of the basement to find his father after the burning bush was just burning brush, and the rainbow bridge was merely the long frown of the morning storm. It's a poem for Jake Adam York, who sadly died about 6 or 7 years ago, I think. We weren't close friends, but we had planned on going camping. And he died a month before he came to UAB to read. And we had been threatening for 2 or 3 years to drink whiskey and talk about blues. And I never got to do it with him. It's something that I really regret. River Elegy for Jake Adam York. There's a couple I'll gloss a few terms. A black snake is what old coal miners call a train. If you're looking at the train as it winds through, it looks like a black snake with all the coal on top of it. And a hogger is a conductor. And there's a song called Stars Fell in Alabama that you may know about. And you know what happens in places like this when it snows? You get a ½ inch of snow on the ground, if it ever snows here. People go out and buy all the milk and bread, run into each other like idiots, and then we get on the Weather Channel and people laugh at us. River Elegy for Jake Adam York. Yesterday's snow, not stars, fell on Alabama, but on my slow jam home over Red Mountain, behind a streak of bread and milk-stocked cars, chocked by a field of white. I can't keep from humming the tune over and over, replacing stars with snow. Tomorrow I would have driven past Tuxedo Junction, where Erskine Hawkins might have brassed those stars 75 years ago in Ensley, and over viaducts beneath which hoggers haven't hung rails with black snakes or pig iron cars in decades, and foundry molds haven't flushed orange for just as long. And on to the sticks through hollers where my kin ripped seams of coal and piled spoils in rippling rows, healing pole pines in their stead. And on to beat 10 of the Warrior River, where fish camps outnumber churches, where a man stepping on another man's land might see a lightning still hunkered into the bank, or just how deep that river channel is. And on to the dirt road's end, where my kin crawled out of the river, where I would have cut and split a seasoned turkey oak for your visit and piled rocks for a pit closer to the slough. So when we would have run and relivered that trot line by the skinny moon, we'd have fire close when we sculled back to the bank. Then over a skillet of skeeting willet cat fillets, I would have mentioned the rendition still stuck in my head even today, Fitzgerald and Armstrong's and the absurd snow. And you would have gone on about you, an Alabama privet switch driving through Colorado on winter days. And I bet I would have learned from you on that night that will never be what I had to learn on my own today, that Holiday and Coltrane flirted through that number too. And the song owes its breath to the 1833 Leonid's meteor shower, the night the stars fell. And I imagine you would have said what I'm thinking now, that a shower of 33 happens only once every couple of lifetimes, and even then it won't happen if you ain't paying attention. This is an elegy for Scott Harris, my best friend and fishing buddy of 40 years, who sadly had a glioblastoma and died a few years ago after a year of battle. Lures for Scott Harris. Last summer's fishing failures dangled from trees, a rapala and jitterbug, a stand of privet paid for. Half-ounce jigs with rubber skirts and jelly worms with wide-gap hooks on 10-pound test we tithed with overzealous casts at bass. Then off we go, our stringers bare, to find a yard to cut, a truck to wash, so we could fill our tackle box we shared again. Today is 12-12-12, the Mayan end, and I, a country boy in Brooklyn for the week, will hail a cab for the first time and think of cows unnerved by fish we missed, and shouts of shit that followed, and dawns to dusks, and always back with you, my childhood friend. Our girls will never know that pond's deep hole a baseball diamond now fills, the city leader's bright idea, or how their fathers sitting in the bleachers on Saturdays a couple decades later can almost feel the stinging nettle against their thighs, the lunker largemouth sweeping the bed with her tail, while plastic lizards jerk and drag across the third base line. Or how when we untrain our ears to baseballs cracking bats and bitchy parents, called strikes and alike, we hear the peepers sounding off in oaks on down the way, our mothers' and fathers' voices calling us home, not too far behind or ahead. I'm going to read some poems from my new collection and a couple of collaborative poems, and maybe end with a poem from the coal life. If y'all are still having fun. Out of speech. That's a translation of ekphrasis, which is a Greek word. Ek, out, phrasis, or phrase, or expression, or speech. And it means writing poetry about visual art. One of our earliest examples is Homer's description of Achilles' shield. About 50 lines, 30 to 50 lines, describing human pursuit and war through the shield of Achilles. I was fortunate enough to obtain grants to go to museums all over the country. I went to about 15 different museums, then went to museums in France and Spain, and then kind of lucked into a poem that ends the collection where I was in Argentina in a park, and it was a wonderful experience with a street artist, and I was writing about him when I sat down, and we kept looking up at each other back and forth, and then all of a sudden we both realized that we were each other's muse for the art. He was sketching me as I was drawing about him. He showed me the sketch he was doing, and I showed him what I was writing. Came up to each other and we hugged, and then he showed me his home in the banyan tree roots. That's where he lived. And in my broken English and, my broken Spanish, though I do have broken English too. In his broken English, we talked about art and human conditions, and everything was broken down to its lowest common denominator. We were just humans who love the world. I'll read that poem probably last. It's a poem, The Philosophy of Subtraction, from Hopper's Excursion in Philosophy. Bed's in everything today. My borrowed one back at the Marriott, comforter bunched at the foot, my dress socks slung to folds like half-dressed gang. Seems to be snowing everywhere but here and in Birmingham, where my wife and daughter are home early from school, despite no accumulation. Both at the kitchen table, I'm sure. My daughter's soup getting cold while she drills her dolls on subtraction, my wife lassoing poor conjugations, slashing l'accent grave aigu. The crock-pot squatting behind them, breaking down muscle, fat, softening carrots, potato skins loosening, leftovers I'll eat on Sunday when I return. This morning I bet my wife pulled the sheets and bedspread extra tight before tucking in the pillows and scraped the low boy clean of my change and receipts on her way to the shower. And like you, Hopper's man, I want to see something, anything but a bed and the rectangle of light before me. My hand curled into my inner thigh, too. Shirt tripped open as I slunk. I, too, no longer feel the woman beside me in bed, friend. I, too, see the pages blank in books I left open the night before. I, too, can't bear my foot towing into the light. I chose in my approach to ekphrastic poems to be able to stretch the canvas around anything. Patrons in the museum, other paintings, the physical edifice. I allowed my subjective renderings to come in like it did in that poem, where the first half of the poem is all about thinking about the family that's back home, which hopefully has been provoked by that painting, which is a painting of the possibilities of intimacy that never happened. Two people on a bed who are nearly touching. One's faced outward, looking down at this square of light. The woman's has her back turned to him, looking at the wall. So that's what I hope to accomplish here, is to have an indirect way of talking about payments. I mentioned my best friend who died, and he tends to come into quite a few poems. And I had this extraordinary experience in Houston. I went to Houston to look at Rothko's. The Menil Library has quite a few Rothkos, and they have the Rothko Chapel, which is this non-denominational chapel with these pallid Rothkos. It's a pallid scene inside of these dark Rothkos and white walls. It's a moving place. But I also saw some surrealist painters, and one of them was Yves Tanguy. And when I got back from that museum, I was going into the bar to have a beer. Right when I walked in, there was a guy who said, "I bet you fish. Come drink a whiskey with me." He had a cowboy hat on, looked like an old or a young oil tycoon or something, big buckle on. I said, "Sure." So I slid up next to him, and it looked like he'd already had about half a shelf of whiskey before I got there. And he says, "All right, bring down that." He was buying $20, $30 shots of whiskey, top shelf whiskey. And he looked at me and said, "I hadn't had a drink in 8 years." I said, "Son, why are you drinking?" He said, "I'm dead." He said, "MD Anderson was right next to us. And he had just been diagnosed with a stage 4 glioblastoma that my best friend was dying from at that moment." So it's those kinds of connections that I didn't want to leave out of these poems, because they were informed by the paintings I was looking at, and then after I had these experiences with people, it changed the shape and manner of the way that I viewed the paintings in memory. My view from here, under Yves Tanguy's lead view. Like a man running away from his tumor, legs fuzzy with speed, skull contorting to the cancer's protean form, a bicuspid plied from the roots, enamel gone, dentin starting to slouch like pudding. Stages 2, 3 lurking on the desert floor below him, stage 4 suspended behind him like a vodka bottle barked with decades of wax. Like the cowboy last night at the hotel bar, who had already drunk his way through the top shelf whiskey, who asked if I fished before I'd slid halfway onto the bar stool. Like his unfettered cough of a confession, these were the first drinks he had knocked back in 8 years. Like the biopsy results he received earlier that day, the hospital bed and gown he refused, the surgery, radiation, chemo, lab rat shit he won't do. Like the 3 phone calls from MD Anderson, his ringtone set to the Jaws theme, while his wife talked about native cutthroat, and while he talked about native cutthroat, and his girlfriend sat motionless, her eyes full of agency at first, then dropped to the overwrought fried green tomato she wouldn't touch. Like my best friend and fishing buddy of 40 years, in his last hour of gurgling, his final movements trying to wipe away his piss as if some primitive reflex awakened by dignity. Like a bass lumbering in deep water at his pond during winter, like his patience, twitching a jig all day in hope of one big bite. Like the glioblastoma the cowboy and my best friend shared, the food they could no longer taste, the splinters in their necks, the names of their children lost in pill bottles. Like the me I see now in Lakeview, the gray smudge and outline of something that they can never catch up to, no matter how fast they run, no matter how long I wait for them. All right. I'll read a poem, a collaborative poem, and then probably a couple poems from Pauline, and we'll have a little discussion.
Yeah, what about the one about the artist of the banyan tree?
I'd love to read that one. I'll read that one first. I have to, since I
You
introduced
said
it.
you would.
I will. I chose this to be the last poem in the collection because all these poems are almost all of them take place in the museum space. And I found that to be exceedingly sterile. There's a certain sense of decorum when people walk into a fine art museum, and the way that they walk around $3 million paintings, and the way that security walks around and looks at me very strangely for standing perhaps in front of a painting for 8 hours, which was very common for me. I was like an old dog sitting next to the masters who's sick. I mean, I wouldn't pee, I wouldn't eat, I would just stand there and sketch and write. So this took place outside And it seemed like the perfect culmination of moving outside of the museum, because that's what I'm trying to do so often in these poems, move into the real world of the human condition and relate it back to the paintings and the condition within the paintings. And here with a street artist and a wannabe poet, you know, sitting there writing, it seemed like it was the right kind of ending for a book like this. Restroke 3, Still Life with Banyan Tree, Buenos Aires. A wreck of elephants that took root. The homeless settle into channels of its dugout canoes lined with faded drapes. The dog sitter's body sickles against his leash of horny mutts. Pigeons blink amber oil and bone. 3 girls with heels and skirts too high and hyacinths blinking from their crowbar waists ring around a lamppost, its steepled hat aslant, a drunken clown. And I, the watcher, am being watched. My arm drapes across a cankled root, my heels fused, knees spread, void between, like a dugout canoe. The cardboard sketch, the man with blinking eyes hands me. And in return, I rip out the poem This One Was. We even trade. He slips into the banyan tree's dugout canoe. I uncat my pen and turn the page. So that first draft that I was writing was lost. Not lost, it was given as a gift, both of us gave each other gifts. So I think that a poem like this too, referencing the metadrama of writing, you know, how we can lose something and come back to it, have an awareness of writing later, an awareness of an experience where we were trying to create art and then recreating something out of that. That was important for me for this.
Do you have this drawing?
Huh?
Do you have this drawing?
Gosh, I wish you would have asked me that. I was on my way to Antarctica for 3 weeks. That's why I stopped off in Buenos Aires. And I put it in my suitcase. And somehow in that little tiny room on that vessel and going back and forth on zodiacs and stuff, I'm not sure what happened to it. It breaks my heart that I don't have it. I remember it. It's still etched into my memory. But somehow that little piece of cardboard what happened. But I need to go back and see if I can find this.
Kind of gets to the experience, just like you lost your draft, but the experience versus the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's almost fitting, even though it's heartbreaking, it's almost fitting. You know, we lose people in the same way, and we go to memories, and we can only draw our art from that. We don't have still lives all the times. All right, I'm going to read one of these collaborative poems. I started writing these collaborative poems about 15 years ago with a friend in graduate school, and it's because we were trying to get out of voice. We found that we were coming to the same kinds of conclusions in our poems. We had the same kind of syntax and syntactical gait, so we were just trying to trip each other up more than anything. So we'd send 2 lines back and forth by email, and when one of us would write cooked, you had to quit, the next person had to start the next one, no matter where you were in the poem. That was the first collection. The second collection, we wrote in all iambic trimeter terces, so it was set in form. We're both trained formalists, so it made sense and it kept us structured. The third collection we're working on right now, we're about 25 poems into, are informed by New York Times crossword puzzles. So we're using the clues from the crossword puzzles to provoke our lines. You couldn't have 2 more opposite people, me and Alan G. Alan G's 15 years younger than me, grew up in Northern Virginia, Buddhist, Taiwanese, has a background in theoretical psychology. So he's always interior. He's trying to push things into the interior of the mind. I'm a redneck from Alabama who spent almost all his life outdoors. So I'm always constantly trying to stretch things outside. So it's that conflict of interior-exterior that I think might be the main trope of our work, overarching trope. This was a piece that I somehow took control of. I went to Ireland when I was in my early 20s, and I went to Donegal and climbed at Bolden in the middle of December and nearly got stuck up there in the dark. But I started this out in Donegal and kind of let it ride. Sometimes he'll take a subject and I'll let it ride into his subject matter. Sometimes we're at odds and we're both bucking for subject matter. And this is an ekphrastic piece too. Donegal landscape. In the distance, another hummock of peat dotted with sheep, another cliff where ancients piled stones. But here the seagulls in black and white sand yield to the monoliths of wood and glass. I stare, reminded by the green of my own monotone childhood. How, by a shore in New England, seagulls dive-bombed my little brother after he threw his sandwich crusts into the air. And I amused myself with the idea of making bracelets out of sandwiches so the gulls could live on my arms. Nothing is altered now. I still see him with his arms flailing like a man on fire. And how many villages here flailed in fire? How many husbands watched their wives led off by soldiers who, frenzied as seagulls, would drift into oil-colored oceans? The docks smell of spoiled fish and nothing else. When I return to the cottage, my children are playing a game with measuring cups. Tomorrow the sleet will shellac the junipers and we'll pile into a booth at the pub while locals argue over keg-line links and the best pint in town. The barkeep doesn't believe in string theory. He argues there is a conspiracy behind wool prices. The light never alters, muted behind clouds, a few strands falling here and there, igniting a wave or some castle ruin in a field long out of use. The scene seems stolen from a Turner. All that's missing are the horses. Where have they gone? The foreground tells us the day is done. A dog sleeps on the dirt road, his paws neatly crossed under his chin. Peat smoke drifts from the chimney. I can barely hear the water. Just to prove that my daughter comes across with precociousness honestly, I'll read a poem about me when I was her age, or earlier. I grew up in a very small house, one bath, 2 bedroom. And when my brothers were in town, at any one time we might have 4 brothers vying for a bathroom in the morning. And my bricklaying daddy.
4 sisters.
There you go.
And
Right, so we would have 1 at the sink, 1 on the pot, and 2 in the bathtub, and all throwing soap and toothbrushes at each other. And my mother sitting there going, when are they going to leave? Well, I remember going into that bathroom one morning and looking down because it was just a toilet, there was no vanity. Toilet, and then right next to it, my mother in a sink over here, pedestal sink with nothing below. Over here is where my mother kept her feminine products. And I remember looking down into that beautiful blue box and seeing these things sticking up like Lincoln logs and imagining that they were toys. So one morning I opened one up and it changed my life. Toilet flowers. You can imagine where this is going. And I probably know more about the history of tampons than any living human. Did about 2 months of research on tampons. And you're about to hear. So now I'll bestow the knowledge.
good thing you have a feminine audience.
Yes. Toilet flowers. See how much you knew about
It will be
this.
lost.
See how much you knew about this.
Taking notes.
Egyptian women tied papyrus fibers into Isis knots, damming the moon blood, the open wound from Thoth. In farther east, girls watched their mothers wrapping theirs out of the same thin paper from which they folded swans. And later, a man designed the catamenial monthly device, and a man called it tampion, a plug for a cannon, keeping out dust and moisture. Only a man would come up with tampion, a plug for a cannon. What's wrong with men? My high school girlfriend called it George. She'd say, George is in town this week, when I walked my fingers up her thigh. But at 10, I knew none of this. They sat in an open box next to the toilet I shared with my 3 brothers, father and mother. They didn't come with mother's warnings or reprimands like, don't sword fight with a plunger, blank will kill you, blank will make you go blind. I knew they were for her, all else was a mystery. So one Sunday morning, while my family still slept, I latched the bathroom door, peeled back the wrapper as if it were a popsicle, and held the plunger, a cannon, a gun barrel. I pulled on the string, holding the pledget like a mouse by its tail. I smelled it, pressed my thumbnail into its soft density, placed it on the sconce like a candle. Pretending to light it, I threw it into the tub like an M80. Imagine Gabriel or Michael lighting the fuse with the red punk of their pupils, then tossing the pure white scourge at Satan. Open another, then 3, 4, more and more, holding them in the corner of my mouth while squinting one eye like my father chewing a cigar, tucking them like grenades into the waistband of my skivvies. One fell into the toilet, slowly opened like a moonflower, burgeoning to life the way I imagined sea monkeys and ads on the back cover of my comics would. Dropped all of them in, one by one, watching as they bloomed in the bowl. My mother's footsteps, her voice behind the door, and I flushed them. The water rose, spilling over the porcelain lip, and when I faced my mother, the bathroom now flooded. I felt shame for her secret I thought I now knew, for the beauty I had created and the sin of creating it. Adama, Adam, me, bloody loam. It's interesting, Adam goes back to bloody loam, and some of the first tampons were mud that was packed. Idea being bloody loam. So, yeah, I'm almost endemically connected to tampons. Well, thank you for being here and listening to me, and I'd be happy to take any questions. If not, I can eat some beef jerky, sit around Indian style.
So this is very personal, but I'm concerned about that tree in Buenos Aires. Was it an enormous banyan tree?
An enormous banyan tree. If you've been around banyan trees, the root systems are like dugout canoes. I mean, when I look at them, you've got the root systems here, and it's the spaces in between the root systems.
Well,
it's like a labyrinth.
The reason I just wonder if it's the same tree that I know of, because I was there with friends, and it was not long after one of my sons had died, and I had this thing where I would always take his ashes when I traveled and leave them someplace. So when we went to Buenos Aires, of course we went to the very famous cemetery.
Right.
And I kept thinking that I'll sprinkle them on by some famous person's tomb. And nothing felt right. But on the way to the cemetery, we'd gone through this park, and there was this enormous banyan tree. And so one of the people with me was one of his very good friends, and I said to her, I just keep thinking of that tree. And I think that's where I want to go. So we went back to the tree and sprinkled the ashes, and I stepped back to take a picture, and my son, his name was Dane, and we used to call him the Great Dane, of course. And just as I was getting ready to take the picture, this enormous Great Dane stepped in front of that tree. And so when you started talking about the tree in the park and your kind of mystical experience, I was just wondering if it was the same tree.
No, it was a park that was probably 2 miles away from the center of Buenos Aires.
Oh, from the same region? I'm not sure.
And it wasn't even, it wasn't marked as a park. I was just walking around and happened to go up to it. I remember it distinctly. I had to kind of walk up to it, and then there were these 2 or 3 huge banyan trees, and one was really big. And if you looked over, you would see drapes and sheets over some of those cavities of the root systems.
Because of people staying there.
People staying there. So yeah, this guy had all of his possessions were in this little area of the banyan tree. He would come out and he would sketch and draw and paint on whatever he could find. Today it was a piece of cardboard. And so I went in there with him and we just sat down and talked.
I found it hard to imagine that one poem was collaborative. It sounded like one voice.
We've got many that sound, people say that. I think it's because though we're so different, we have a very common sensibility when it comes to poetry. And I think that when you're writing a poem like this, I don't feel like it's me. It is almost a persona poem. So I think that we're adopting each other's syntax and language when we allow one another to come into that subject matter.
I suppose it becomes about the poem and not about you and all.
It's all about the poem, yeah. I mean, those little sprinkles, you can't get around those sprinkles of your autobiography. But as I tell my students, you have to find the end of the poem. You don't have to find the fruition of your autobiography, or you're going to ruin poems. For instance, in that first poem I read, An Hour's Speech, it says, "I can't feel the woman in bed beside me anymore, friend." Because that's what the painting required for me to say. That doesn't mean that I have a horrible relationship with my wife. But you have to write to that fruition. And so many people make the mistake sometimes of mistaking the poet for the speaker in a poem, even if there are a number of autobiographical details. You probably, since you know a little bit about my autobiography, or my biography, you probably heard quite a bit in there that you said, oh, that makes sense. He's writing about X, Y, or Z. But they're all lies. That's what's beautiful about being a poet. I can be a liar.
So in the poem you read, when your family was away and power was out, and why did you choose to have that woman be in Montana?
I was watching the news earlier that day, or the day before even, and 9 inches dumped in Lubbock, Texas. So I was thinking about Texas, and then I was thinking about, because I use the collaborative we, how I could talk about people throughout the country. So I was thinking about someone who could be kind of isolated like I was. And Montana seemed like that kind of isolated place where we would have snow and people perhaps isolated in, and then a woman confessing of an affair. Why Montana? Who knows? It just came to mind. I think it had more to do with me feeling a particular way in that moment than anything else. I mean, if the lights would have been on, maybe I would have set her in Florida. Who knows? Yeah. Yes?
We would fly into Livingston, Montana a lot, and it was a real arts place.
Yeah.
And listen to poetry. I wrote quite a bit of poetry when I was younger, but I started painting, and then everything else started falling to the wayside. Every now and then I would get something will come to mind and I'll jot it down, but I've never compiled anything out. This is about 25 years ago now. But I'm glad I glanced in.
Oh, good.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, yeah, because of the visual art also.
Yeah, and there's also this right next to Livingston is a place called Chico where the snow is falling and they have the hot springs that run 24 hours a day.
Right.
And but you can write a lot of good poetry in that area, wildlife, and I wrote a lot about wildlife, horses, fury, and that kind of stuff.
Well, all right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed this.
Thank you.